Hello, and welcome to this presentation on universal strategies and resources for student wellness during this time of remote learning. My name is Catherine Leswing. I'm with the Bureau of Student Wellness at the New Hampshire Department of Education. And let's get started. So today's agenda, we're going to do a brief introduction. Then we're going to look at some risk factors and protective factors that impact students' ability to be resilient and successful in their social lives, their emotional lives, and their academic lives. And then we're going to look at some universal strategies and resources for students and for us to employ during this time of remote learning. And then we will close out. So quick introduction, like I said, my name is Catherine Leswing. I'm the MTSSP consultant for South Central New Hampshire at the Office of Social and Emotional Wellness at the New Hampshire Department of Education. I've put my email up there. If you have any questions that you'd like further information on, feel free to email me after you watch this presentation. Generally, when I do this presentation live, I like to do one glow and one grow. And have folks introduce themselves that way. I will do myself just as a model today, but maybe you can think about what's a glow and a grow from this experience. I know it's been a really challenging experience in a lot of ways, so reminding myself that there are some glows that have come out of it is helpful. For me, a glow from this experience is that I've really gotten to spend a lot more time with my family, my son, and seen him grow in a way that I don't always get the opportunity to do. One grow from this experience has been that life has really sort of all blurred together. There's not a lot of division between work time and family time, and it's really up to myself to regulate sort of the boundaries along those lines, and that can definitely be a challenge. So if you want to at home think about what's a glow and grow for you during this time. All right, so we're going to jump right in here. This little graphic here really is a very simplified version of what our work at the Office of Social and Emotional Wellness is geared towards, which is student resiliency and the building up the factors that help students be resilient so that they can be socially and emotionally well and come to school ready to learn. The way that we approach this work is by looking at it in two categories: protective factors and risk factors. Protective factors are those things, those internal mechanisms that allow people to handle life as it comes, the challenges and its successes. Really the ability to adapt. Risk factors are those things in the environment that are really detrimental to one's ability to handle life as it comes. And so if we look at this as an equation, we can think about it as the more protective factors that a person has access to, the less likely they are to succumb to certain risk factors in the environment. As educators, we have, generally speaking, very little control over the risk factors that a student is exposed to in their environment. However, we do have some control over helping students build up the protective factors, those internal mechanisms that they have access to. And the more protective factors a student has, and the fewer risk factors they have, the more resiliency they will have access to. We also want to think about how do we build the systems that focus on building out student resiliency in a sustainable way. This is so important to our work at the Bureau of Student Wellness. We are always looking for ways to create systems that will stand the test of time, transfer from one year's work to the next year's, withstand staff turnover, because ultimately, at the end of the day, this is about students, and we want to make sure that they are getting access to programs and initiatives that work. And so thinking about how do we do this sustainably? And this pertains even to today as we move into remote learning How are our systems consistent and sustainable for students? So that's something to just keep in the back of our minds. Our work at the Bureau of Student Wellness, it has really originated largely out of some research that was done at the Search Institute starting in 1989. The Search Institute found, well, they were really asking the question, what is it that allows some students to meet life's challenges with relative success while some students still really struggle? And what they found is that there are a number of protective factors, they call them developmental assets, that contribute to a student's ability to handle life and certain risk factors. They've identified 40 developmental assets, and then they bucketed them into these 8 categories that you see here that they then divided into internal and external assets. The way that we are presenting these resources and strategies for you today is categorizing them in these buckets of types of assets from the Search Institute's categories. So what are ways and strategies and resources we can support students, we can empower students? And right now I'm going to talk real briefly about the Search Institute's research a little bit more. So why do we really use this research as a foundation for a lot of our work and programming? The research is very, very clear that the more developmental assets, meaning the more protective factors students have, the more positive outcomes they have. So we see the grayish purple line bar is students who have 31 to 40 assets. So that's the highest number of assets. They are far more likely to succeed in school, value diversity, maintain good health, exhibit leadership. At the same time, those with the fewest assets, 0 to 10, are much less likely to have these levels, these indicators of success. Furthermore, the fewer the assets a student has, the more likely they are to engage in risky behavior. So we see the group that has 0 to 10 assets is far, far more likely to have problematic use with drugs and alcohol, engage in sexual activity, and violence. These statistics are New Hampshire specific. They come from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey in 2017. It was taken by high school students, so keep that in mind. But these are some of the risk factors that our students in New Hampshire face. 30% report living with someone who has had a drug or alcohol problem. 25% have had food insecurity, not enough food at home. 9% have at least one parent or other adult in prison, and 14% have heard adults in their home engaging in domestic violence. 15% have seriously considered attempting suicide. These statistics are even more alarming when we think that now students are no longer having their 6 to 8 hours at the school building a day, and that they're really, the students exposed to these risk factors are at home all day long now. So our work is really truly more important than ever. So if we think about the risk factors that students in New Hampshire are exposed to, we can think about it as in the lens of the more protective factors that we are able to help build up in these students, perhaps the more likely they will be able to access some resiliency and to meet these challenges and to work through them in a constructive way. This is, again, is national data, and it shows you what % of students fall into the different level of assets, or how many assets they have access to. So we see that the highest group, the 31 to 40 assets group, is actually the smallest chunk of the pie. So it's only 11%. Moreover, over half of the students, over 50% of the students have fewer than 20 assets. So we have our work cut out for us, for sure. So that's a little background information, and now I'm going to get into more specifically our work. At the Bureau of Student Wellness, the Office of Social and Emotional Wellness, we take the MTSSB approach, meaning we focus on helping schools build out systems of multi-tiered systems of support. What does that mean? It means that we are helping schools organize people, analyze data, and plan for interventions that will help students universally at that tier 1 level, which is about roughly, we generally say about 80% of the students fall into that universal category. We help them choose and develop programs at the tier 2 level, which is a more intensive level. It's more targeted interventions for probably about 15% of the student population. And then really designing some interventions for students who need intensive help, usually less than 5% of the student body. And that's your wraparound care where you have teams working to help students with some more serious behavioral and emotional issues. Today's presentation, we're focusing really on that bottom part of the pyramid. What are interventions and strategies that we can do for all students at the universal level and from a remote distance now? So again, as I present these resources and strategies, they'll fall into the categories of the Search Institute's different buckets there of support, empowerment, boundaries, expectations, etc. So in the following slides, you will see the resources. We will make this PowerPoint, the resources in this PowerPoint available. They'll be linked below this video for you to be able to access. So the first category that the Search Institute talks about is providing support for students. How can we do this in a remote environment? We can host a virtual community conversation is one option. This could include families, parents, caretakers, and also local mental health professionals. So maybe you have folks from your community mental health center. You might have the regional public health network and some school leadership, and really have a conversation letting families know how they can access mental health resources during this time. I think that is more important than ever right now. A lot of folks, whether they have clinical diagnoses or not, are having some mental health challenges with the anxiety of what's going on, the difficulty with being isolated and staying at home. There's a lot of work to do, and hosting a virtual community conversation would be one way to address it. Your district could consider starting a Ripple Kindness Community Project. This is an organization and a website that helps schools organize kindness projects, simple acts of kindness projects. It's a nice way to engage students remotely. You could also staff a helpline for families with regard to academic content, guidance on SEL, and information technology. A lot of us are feeling very isolated and like we don't have access to the resources and the help that we might need, especially when we're faced with new technological issues. We don't understand the academic content that's coming home with our students. There's a lot of questions out there, and so staffing a helpline would be a great way to support families and students. And here I've linked some resources for you. So there's a link to the community mental health centers in New Hampshire, the regional public health networks, also the Ripple Kindness Community Project website, and last but not least, an example of, it's not a helpline per se, but it's an online resource guide that the Merrimack School District has created for families. And it has extensive resources. It's laid out in a very logical, comprehensive way, and it's very easy to access. And it provides a whole host of resources for families to access with regard to student wellness. I highly recommend checking it out and seeing if it might be something that your district could do too. So next we have empower. How do we empower students from afar? One simple way to do that is to keep them up to date. I know a lot of educators are already doing a lot of these suggestions in this presentation, but having that reminder that keeping communication lines open is one way for students to feel like they have a level of control. I think with this particular challenge that we're faced with right now, the COVID-19 pandemic, there's huge feelings of powerlessness, not just for students, but for families, really all of us. And so empowering young people to really step up and advocate for themselves in the ways that they can and over the things that they do have control of in their lives is helpful. So keeping them up to date. Asking students for their feedback is a nice way to also feel like they give them the feeling that they have a voice. Sometimes their feedback can be, cheeky, for lack of a better word, but giving them an opportunity to provide feedback is a nice way to engage them and empower them. Creating opportunities for service remotely is a huge way to empower students. It will allow them to feel that they have a purpose and really are able to help. I think a lot of us are feeling powerless again over how do we help people who are on the front lines of this crisis. And so on the next slide, I've provided a few resources for how to offer some remote service opportunities for students. And then again, staffing a helpline, this one being more related to student safety, providing access to services and basic needs for students. We know that mandated reporting of neglect and abuse in New Hampshire has decreased significantly since the turn to remote learning, and it's not really thought to be because there's a decreased incidence of neglect and abuse happening, but because the reporting is not happening. So making sure that we keep those lines open is very critical. So here are some resources and ideas for how to engage students in having them provide feedback, keeping them up to date. Remote service opportunities, they could do a letter writing campaign to the elderly or to a retirement home, of course, keeping in mind best health practices and making sure mail is quarantined for the appropriate amount of time before it's delivered. Food pantry donations. Food pantries are really on the front lines right now, having students check in on their own classmates. And then here's a list of really important resources that have to do with student safety, suicide prevention, and the prevention of neglect and abuse. So those are resources that you could share with families, even if you aren't planning to staff a full helpline. Next bucket is boundaries and expectations. This one is tricky. Parents and caretakers are now having to set not only the boundaries and expectations for what takes place in daily life in the home, but now also with what happens at school, which is now in the home as well. So helping students understand their role in setting boundaries within the remote instruction model. My colleague, Lisa Hayward, did a session on this that you can also find on our YouTube channel, How to Create a Positive Environment in the Remote Instruction Model. I highly recommend checking that out. She has some great tips for how to help educators set those boundaries and helping families then enforce some of those boundaries or knowing what they are. You can, as a school, post school rules, behavioral expectations, and community values for students very visibly, very clearly, and again, Lisa Hayward's presentation on this will provide some great ideas for how to do that. You can write a press release describing the district's response to remote instruction. This is a great way to really give your school district some positive publicity and also engage the community to understand what is actually happening within within the remote instruction model. Here are a few resources. There are some articles, an article on how to teach boundaries. We have been doing Facebook Live video quick chat sessions on some of these different subject matters. We did one recently on boundaries and expectations. There's a link to that video there. District by district, you can choose how you want to post school rules and classroom rules and how to keep students engaged in what are the expectations of them and what are the boundaries. We know that boundaries have been blurred a little bit even with teachers. What are appropriate times of the day to contact teachers? What platform do you want teachers and students to be communicating on? All of that stuff is important to state explicitly. And if you are interested in writing a press release, there's a guide to writing a press release linked here, as well as an example from the Nashua Telegraph that they wrote about what remote learning looks like in their community. Constructive use of time. This is a very important one now that we are all really in charge of setting our own schedules in the household. One way to help students use their time constructively would be to have them document their remote instruction experience in a creative format. This would be an especially useful tool for high school students, maybe middle school students, especially those students who are experiencing a sense of loss or disappointment from missed experiences like high school prom, senior week, even graduation. You can encourage outdoor activity while the stay-at-home order is in effect. It does not discourage outdoor exercise, especially when social distancing is being practiced. Our New Hampshire state parks are still open with the exception of some coastline beaches. Hiking trails are open. And you can support the use of mindfulness practices and time management skills. So on this page, we have some resources about free platforms for students to document their remote learning experience on. I see a typo right there. Missed the N. There are outdoor activities that they can engage in. Some resources here, links to the New Hampshire State Parks, and also a wonderful free app called All Trails, where you can find all the hiking trails in your area, and a few useful links to mindfulness tools and tips for time management. Commitment to learning. So making sure that students don't feel like this is an extended vacation, and really keeping in the forefront of their minds and our minds that this is a time for learning without putting an added pressure on families and caretakers and teachers for it to look perfectly, but really helping students to feel committed to learning, even if it's looking a little differently. So providing frequent feedback to students will have them feeling that the work that they are doing and they're submitting is valued by their teachers and is worthwhile. It will keep them engaged in what they are learning and ready and willing to do the next assignment. Also ensuring daily check-ins for all students. The more that we check in with each other, the more we will feel like we are being supported and that learning and school is actually still happening. I find that even having to the ability that you can in your district, video check-ins in a responsible platform helps us all feel more connected and that we are actually still in school or still in work. You can also provide links to your local libraries, the New Hampshire State Library, or other free services that will encourage reading for pleasure. So here I've provided a few tips and then a couple of links to find ebooks. Your town or city public library likely has a whole collection of ebooks that are available for free. And Audible Stories just announced that they're offering over 100 children's stories for free during the pandemic. Positive values. So how do we teach and build up positive values for students while we are not in their physical presence? One is to design a virtual learning environment of responsibility and integrity. And again, I would highly recommend checking out Lisa Hayward's Remote Learning Academy on how to set a positive remote learning environment. And also ensuring open and equitable classroom discussion and connection. This is so critical right now, and it's important to make sure that everybody is there, everyone is on board and able to participate in a meaningful way. So making sure that technology barriers are out of the way, language barriers aren't an issue, and that all students are coming to the virtual classroom and able to participate. I've just linked here a few useful articles about how to best practices around doing that. And again, I think one of the best resources is on our YouTube page, which is Lisa Hayward's presentation. So social competencies, how do we teach social and emotional competence while we are at a distance? One method that I like to use even when we're in each other's physical presence is using literacy-based approaches to SEL, or social and emotional learning. And this looks like using literature or stories to teach social and emotional lessons. So infusing a few questions about social and emotional competence into your normal questions that might be checks for understanding or more text-based questions, and having some of those SEL questions in there with those. You could share your SEL curriculum or infuse SEL into existing content that you're providing virtually now, and also supporting cultural awareness in your virtual classroom is really important. So here, I recommend looking at this literacy-based approach resource that teaches how to frame some questions in an SEL framework, and will help with the development of that and infusion of that into your already existing curriculum. You can also check out Choose Love, which is an SEL curriculum endorsed by the state of New Hampshire, as well as Castle resources here. And you can also check out a couple of resources and articles about how to promote cultural awareness in your digital virtual learning space. Positive identity. So how do we help students have a positive identity? It's worth noting that the last four developmental assets we've been talking about, commitment to learning, positive values, social competencies, and positive identity, are internal assets. And so having our supports and scaffolds for students as they build up and they foster these internal assets is really important, and it takes a little bit more forethought, I would say. One way we can help foster positive identity for students is giving them opportunities for student advocacy and engagement. We can help teach them goal setting, and especially when we do SMART goals that are manageable and achievable. Achieving small short-term goals builds self-esteem and positive identity. And last but not least, we can be especially empathetic to feelings of loss, disappointment, anxiety that are coming up for a lot of us, and especially for youth whose whole world in a lot of ways is their school environment and their learning community. And a lot of big things are being canceled. Students have been working all semester on different productions, theater productions, concerts, been working towards graduation, really looking forward to some big events. And so having some empathy and allowing those feelings to be felt. So for student advocacy, there are a few ways you can promote this. There's an Action Civics curriculum called MICVA Challenge that has some really interesting resources you can do. They have a soapbox speech there. That's an easy activity that you could do from afar, have students write their own soapbox speech about an issue they care about, and they could even present them online in a digital classroom environment. You could also plan a student advocacy day, which would be a fun way to connect remotely to build positive identity. You could help students build some SMART goals with the tools that I've provided here, some recommendations there. And then last but not least, there are some resources here about how to help students handle disappointment and loss, including one of our special shout out from the Bureau of Student Wellness, one of our Facebook Live videos that talks about dealing with disappointment and loss. So these are the resources that I have provided for you. Again, I would encourage you to connect with these resources by downloading the PowerPoint presentation. You can connect with us at NH Student Wellness on Facebook or on Twitter at NH Schools. We're tagging things hashtag NH Learns Remotely, and we have a new remote learning website up for the state of New Hampshire. It's www.nhlearnsremotely.com. Thanks for tuning in today, and we look forward to hearing from you and connecting with you soon. Be well, everyone.